A woman we'll call Diane, a retired schoolteacher from a small town outside Columbus, Ohio, once told a researcher that she sent off her DNA kit expecting exactly one thing: a pie chart. Some percentage German, some percentage Irish, the usual. A weekend curiosity, the kind of thing you do once and mostly forget about. What she got back instead was a message that made her sit down at her kitchen table and read it 3 times. Buried in her match list was a flagged connection to a genetic study out of Harvard and the Smithsonian, a link tracing back to a cemetery in colonial Maryland, to a settlement founded in 1634, to bones that had been in the ground for nearly 400 years. Somewhere in that tangle of ancestry, her family tree brushed up against governors, landowners, men whose names are still carved into the stonework of buildings she had never set foot in. Nobody in Diane's family had ever mentioned money. Nobody had mentioned power. Her father drove a delivery truck for 30 years. Her mother took in sewing to help cover the mortgage on a house that decades later was still not quite paid off. What Diane inherited, as far as she knew, was that modest brick house and a set of her grandmother's dishes. And yet here was the science, cold and precise and utterly indifferent to family mythology, telling her that 300 or 400 years ago, her blood and the blood of American aristocracy were, quite literally, the same blood. She sat with that for a long time, she said, not because it felt like good news, because it didn't feel like anything she had a category for. If she really was distantly related to people who founded fortunes and governed colonies, where had that inheritance gone? Who decided, somewhere back along the branches of that family tree, that one line would keep the money in the name, and another would end up teaching second grade in Ohio, wondering how she was going to afford her own retirement? That question, and not the DNA percentages, not the pie chart, turned out to be the real story hiding inside Diane's results. And it turns out scientists have been chasing the same question for years, using tools far more powerful than anything available even a decade ago. Diane's story isn't unusual. It's happening to thousands of people right now, and it points toward one of the strangest, most uncomfortable questions in American history. If wealth and power can trace themselves back through centuries of the same bloodlines, why doesn't everyone descended from those bloodlines end up wealthy and powerful too? For the last several years, geneticists, historians, and economists have been quietly building an answer, piece by piece, using tools nobody had access to even a decade ago. Ancient DNA extraction, identity by descent mapping, and genealogical databases holding the family trees of tens of millions of people. What they've found doesn't just explain Diane's mismatched inheritance, it reveals the actual machinery behind why some American families stay powerful for 300 years and why the vast majority of their genetic relatives never see a dollar of it. To understand what Diane found, you have to go back to where her match led, to the spring of 1634, when 2 small ships called the Ark and the Dove dropped anchor where the Potomac River meets the Chesapeake Bay. Aboard were roughly 150 passengers, a mix of English gentlemen investing in a new colonial venture, craftsmen chasing a fresh start, and indentured servants who had signed away years of their labor simply for passage across the Atlantic. They landed on a peninsula, built a fort, and named their settlement St. Mary's City, the first permanent English foothold in what would become Maryland. Winters were brutal. Disease was constant. Some of the passengers who stepped off those ships were dead within a year or two, buried in a small chapel cemetery that would eventually hold more than 400 graves, most of them unmarked, their occupants unknown for the next 3.5 centuries. The passengers who waited ashore that spring had no idea they were founding anything that would last. They had even less idea that 4 centuries later, scientists would dig up their bones and read their DNA like a diary, one capable of naming the dead, tracing their descendants across an entire continent, and quietly exposing exactly how unevenly their legacy would come to be divided. What those diaries would eventually reveal is where the story turns genuinely upsetting. In 2026, a team from the 23andMe Research Institute, Harvard Medical School, and the Smithsonian Institution published their findings in the journal Current Biology. After years spent extracting ancient DNA from 49 skeletons buried in St. Mary's City's Old Chapel Cemetery between 1634 and 1730. The team, led by geneticist Iadowin Harney and Harvard's David Reich, compared that ancient DNA against the genetic profiles of more than 11.5 million living 23andMe research participants, hunting for shared segments of DNA that reveal family relationships across centuries. What they found was staggering. Roughly 1.3 million living Americans carry a detectable genetic tie to those original colonists. About 9,000 of them are close enough to be flagged as very likely direct descendants. But it's what the researchers found underground before they even ran a single genetic test that hits hardest. Among the burials, archaeologists identified a man they believe was Governor Thomas Green, buried alongside his wife Anne and their son Leonard, laid to rest in lead coffins, a luxury reserved for the colony's elite, heavy and expensive to import, meant to signal status even in death. A few yards away, in ordinary earth with no coffin at all, they found the remains of two young men in their 20s. Their skeletons told a very different story, the unmistakable wear of a lifetime of brutal physical labor, signs of malnutrition, joints and bones, showing the toll of hard use before either man had reached 30. They had been indentured servants. The team also uncovered the grave of a boy, about 8 years old at the time of his death, whose DNA revealed both African and European ancestry, and whose bones showed he had been born right there in the colony. One of the very first American-born children in that cemetery, laid to rest in a simple gable-lidded coffin wrapped in a plain shroud, his life beginning and ending inside the same small, unequal world. Lead archaeologist Douglas Owsley, who had first excavated the governor's coffins back in 1992 and spent decades waiting for the technology to finally identify who was inside them, has spoken about how strange it feels to give a name back to someone who had been anonymous for 400 years. It is, in a very real sense, restoring a person's identity after history erased it. But identifying Thomas Green was only ever half the discovery. The other half was quieter and far more troubling. 300 years later, DNA can now draw a straight biological line connecting the governor's family to more than 1 million living Americans. And it can just as easily draw a line from those two uncoffined servants, and from that 8-year-old boy to 1 million more. The bones don't know the difference. They never did. Only the ground around them did. And, as it turns out, that same invisible line in the ground never really went away. It just moved above ground, into bank accounts, deeds, and diplomas, and kept being redrawn for the next 4 centuries. That contrast, a lead coffin 20 feet from an unmarked grave, both of them now genetically tied to millions of ordinary Americans, is really the entire question this investigation is built around, just written in soil instead of numbers. Why did one line of descendants end up governing a colony and building fortunes for centuries, while another line, carrying comparable DNA, ended up buried without so much as a wooden box? The genes alone can't answer that, so scientists went looking somewhere else, not underground this time, but in the paper trail. Long before DNA testing existed, Americans were already obsessed with proving exactly this kind of descent. Lineage societies sprang up across the country in the 1800s, organizations built entirely around certifying who could and couldn't prove blood ties to a qualifying ancestor. Membership meant notarized paperwork, sworn affidavits, parish records, stretching back centuries. These weren't hobbyist clubs. They were gatekeeping machines, and tellingly, the families who could most easily produce that paperwork were, overwhelmingly, the same families who already held land and capital. In Boston, that gatekeeping took on a more intimate form. A tight network of families, the Cabots, the Lowells, the Adamses, the Appletons, became known half-jokingly as the Boston Brahmins, a name borrowed from India's priestly caste. What made them different wasn't just money, it was who they married. Generation after generation, sons and daughters from this same small circle married each other, keeping fortunes consolidated instead of scattered. Down in Virginia, a parallel dynasty formed around the earliest English planting families, and when the Gilded Age arrived in the late 1800s, a wave of new industrial fortunes, Vanderbilt, Rockefeller, Carnegie, Astor, tried to buy their way into that older bloodline through the exact same tool, marriage. The old guard didn't make it easy. Caroline Astor, the self-appointed arbiter of New York high society, reportedly held the line that no family could be considered truly respectable until they were at least 3 generations removed from whoever's hands had actually gotten dirty earning the money, an almost impossible bar for families whose fortunes had been made within living memory. The Vanderbilts, dismissed at first as vulgar new money, spent staggering sums arranging unions with cash-strapped European aristocrats and old established families alike, purchasing with dollars what centuries of pedigree couldn't otherwise sell. It is a strange kind of irony. The same families who insisted their status came from breeding, not money, spent enormous amounts of money to keep their breeding exclusive. None of this happened by accident, and none of it happened quietly. Society columns of the era tracked engagements between old and new money the way modern financial press tracks corporate mergers, because, in a very real sense, that's exactly what they were. Mergers of capital and pedigree, negotiated by parents on behalf of children who often had little say in the matter. A daughter from an old, cash-poor Boston family marrying a Vanderbilt son wasn't simply a romance. It was a transaction that moved a name in one direction and a fortune in the other, and it worked precisely because both sides understood, without ever having to say it aloud, exactly what they were trading. Here's where an economic historian named Gregory Clark enters the story, because he found a way to actually measure whether all that maneuvering worked. You can't survey people about their great-great-grandparents' bank balances. Those records simply don't survive or never existed in the first place. So Clark, working at the University of California, Davis, tracked something more durable, Rare surnames, distinctive enough that a snapshot in time can be reasonably assumed to belong to one extended family, then followed those names forward across university enrollment rolls, medical licensing boards, and legislative rosters, sometimes for 200 years at a stretch. Picture a surname that, in 1850, showed up 10 times more often than you'd expect among licensed physicians. If that same surname is still showing up 5 times more often than expected among physicians 100 years later, something durable is being transmitted, and it isn't captured by a single noisy comparison of one father's income against one son's. It's a signal running quietly through the entire extended family, generation after generation. What he found stunned economists. Conventional wisdom said family advantage mostly washes out within 2 or 3 generations. Clark's surname data said otherwise. A persistence rate for elite status of roughly 0.7 to 0.8, far higher than anyone had calculated using ordinary income comparisons. And when he ran the identical method on Sweden, the United States, China, even Qing dynasty China, the number barely moved. Elite surnames took 10 to 15 generations, 3 to 4.5 centuries, to fully fade to average. Not 2 generations, not 5, 10 to 15. Tax policy changed, school systems changed, entire political systems rose and fell. The persistence rate didn't. That single number is the reason this documentary exists, and it's also where the scientific community starts to disagree, sharply. Clark's own reading leans toward biology. The idea that if status persists at nearly the same rate, no matter what a society does to level the field, then something heritable, some mix of diligence, planning ability, and drive, might be riding along inside these families the same way eye color does. Plenty of equally credible researchers reject that reading, and it's worth sitting with their argument because it changes the entire emotional tenor of this story. A surname was never just a genetic marker, it's a marker of legal architecture too. For centuries, primogeniture sent an entire state to a single eldest son instead of splitting it among every child, mechanically concentrating wealth no matter who was more capable, more diligent, or more deserving by any measure. Trusts, drafted by lawyers, were built specifically to survive across generations and shield fortunes from exactly the kind of dilution DNA alone would produce. Access to elite universities for most of American history depended far more on family connections and legacy preference than on any measurable ability. None of that requires inheriting a single useful trait. It only requires inheriting a lawyer, a name, and an invitation. And the marriage patterns of the Boston Brahmins weren't incidental. Researchers studying assortative mating, the tendency of people to marry within their own social and economic tier, have shown that this behavior alone, compounded over 10 generations, produces persistence numbers almost identical to Clark's, with no biology required at all. Picture it as compound interest applied to advantage instead of money. Every generation that marries strictly within the same narrow circle doubles down on whatever legal, financial, and social protections that circle already has, regardless of what any individual child happens to be capable of. 2 explanations then, 1 identical number. Most serious researchers in the field now believe the honest answer is that both forces are tangled together so tightly that untangling them may never be fully possible, and that the families who built the longest-lasting fortunes likely never needed to choose between talent and privilege, because for 300 years, they were never forced to be separate things. And here's the twist. The DNA reveals that the surname data alone never could. None of this required a bloodline to actually stay biologically exclusive, quite the opposite. The St. Mary's City researchers found that descendants of the original colonists didn't stay clustered in one wealthy enclave. Over 3 centuries, they scattered across the entire country, following the same westward migration as everyone else, into Virginia, the Carolinas, over the Appalachians, out to the Pacific, riding wagons and later trains, and later still simply driving, tracing more or less the same route Diane's own ancestors likely followed into Ohio a century and a half ago. Some of those branches climbed into extraordinary wealth. Most didn't. Genetically, there's nothing that marks a wealthy family as distinct from anyone else descended from the same small colonial population. A Rockefeller and a retired schoolteacher in Ohio can share genetic ties back to the very same handful of founding settlers, simply because those settlers had so few descendants at first, and so many by now, that their DNA is scattered across tens of millions of living Americans. Wealth was never written into blood the way eye color is. It rode alongside a much narrower, much more deliberately guarded inheritance. Money, marriage, legal protection, that had almost nothing to do with genetics and everything to do with who was allowed through which door and who was quietly left standing outside it. Not every family that got through that door managed to stay. The Vanderbilt fortune is the textbook cautionary tale. And it matters here because it proves the persistence Clark measured isn't automatic. It has to be actively maintained generation after generation, or it collapses. At Cornelius Vanderbilt's death, The family controlled a fortune that, relative to the size of the American economy at the time, dwarfed almost anything that exists today. Within 2 generations, it was gone, poured into palatial mansions so large and so specialized that nobody could ever resell them, divided again and again among dozens of heirs until no single branch held enough to matter, spent by a family raised from birth to expect permanent abundance rather than trained to protect it. By the time a large Vanderbilt family reunion was held decades later, historians note there wasn't reportedly a single millionaire left among the hundreds of descendants who showed up. Heirs to one of the largest fortunes in American history, standing in a room together, none of them rich. Shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations, the old saying goes, and it shows up again and again in the record, across dozens of unrelated families, almost like a law of physics. What separated the families who stayed wealthy for centuries from the ones who burned through a fortune in a lifetime wasn't talent, and it certainly wasn't genetics distributed unevenly among heirs. There's no reason to believe the Vanderbilt grandchildren were less capable than the Cabot grandchildren 300 miles north. It was institutional discipline. Trusts built specifically to outlive their creators and legally restrict what any single heir could withdraw, marriages arranged to consolidate rather than divide, a culture that treated the fortune as something to be protected rather than enjoyed. The families who won this particular game, across 3 or 4 centuries, were not the ones with the most gifted children. They were the ones who built the strongest fences. Which brings the story back to Diane, sitting at her kitchen table in Ohio, with a DNA report she didn't know how to feel about. She said she went looking for her own paper trail after that, the way a lot of people do, once a result like that lands in their inbox. She found a great-great-great-grandfather who had been a tenant farmer working land he never owned, on the outer edge of a state carved out of what had once been the frontier. No trust fund, no lead coffin, no lawyer keeping the estate intact for the next generation. Just a name in a county record, and then another name, and then Diane. Somewhere among the 9,000 people the St. Mary's City researchers flagged as close descendants of those original colonists, there are almost certainly people just like her, schoolteachers, warehouse workers, nurses, mechanics, sharing a genetic thread with governors and industrialists, and never once seeing a cent, an acre, or an introduction that their bloodline was supposedly entitled to. That isn't a glitch in the system. According to the science, it is the system, working exactly as it has for 400 years. Biology spread the bloodline wide, across millions of people, the way biology always does, indifferent, generous, uninterested in status. Wealth stayed narrow, protected generation after generation by lawyers, marriages, and institutions that had nothing to do with DNA and everything to do with deliberate human choice, made and remade by people who understood, long before anyone had a name for it, exactly what they were defending. That distinction has teeth today, far beyond old cemeteries and old money. Researchers studying legacy admissions at elite universities, institutions historically built by and for exactly the kind of interlocking families this investigation has traced, have found that a surname's advantage in reaching a school like Harvard or Oxford has barely diminished in 200 years. That isn't ancient history. It's a live, measurable echo of the same mechanism running today, using the same tools of consolidation that kept the Cabots and the Lowells married to each other 3 centuries ago. Not better genes passed quietly down the generations, but better access, negotiated and renegotiated, decade after decade, by people who understood exactly what they were protecting. It also reframed something millions of people do every year without a second thought, spitting into a plastic tube and mailing it off, expecting a tidy list of countries their ancestors came from. Almost nobody expects what the St. Mary's City study actually demonstrated, that the very same database is precise enough to reconstruct the identity of a governor who died in 1651, and powerful enough to reveal that a sitting United States senator and a warehouse worker in Ohio might be, genetically, 7th cousins descended from the exact same ship's passenger list. The technology has quietly collapsed the biological distance between ordinary American and old American aristocracy to almost nothing. And it has done this at the precise historical moment when the financial and social distance between those two people has never been wider. That is not a coincidence. According to the researchers who study this, it is the entire story, compressed into a single contradiction. Biology spreads out, generation after generation, the way it always has. Wealth and status do not spread with it. They are held deliberately by people who never stopped choosing who gets to keep them. Diane, for her part, said she didn't feel proud when she read her results. She didn't feel cheated either, not exactly. She felt something closer to strange, a kind of quiet vertigo, she called it, realizing that the line separating her ordinary life from a life of old money and old power wasn't drawn in her blood at all. It was drawn somewhere else entirely, in a decision some ancestor made about who to marry, in a lawyer's office 300 years ago, in a lead coffin bought for one family and denied to another 20 feet away in the same cemetery. Her DNA didn't lie to her. It just told her the truth nobody's family stories ever do, that the past is far more connected and far more unequal than either version lets on. There is something almost unbearably intimate about that fact once you sit with it. Somewhere out there, right now, the descendants of Governor Thomas Greene and the descendants of the 2 unnamed servants buried without coffins 20 feet from him are almost certainly, unknowingly, sitting at the same Thanksgiving table. They are married into the same families. They are distant cousins who will spend their whole lives never knowing it, passing each other in grocery store aisles, sitting in the same church pews, sharing more DNA than most people realize they share with anyone. The blood was never the boundary. It never divided anyone from anyone else. It connected almost everyone to almost everyone else, quietly, invisibly, for 400 years. The boundary was built somewhere else entirely, on purpose, by people who understood exactly what they were building, and who kept building it. Generation after generation, long after the ships that brought their ancestors here had rotted at the bottom of the bay. The choosing of who got to keep what that shared blood eventually built, that was never left to chance at all.